From the time he murdered his parents as a teenager until his death under an assumed name, William Leslie Arnold's life intersected with several other people, and it left many of them wondering, who was he really? I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. I have a quick schedule note and a little bit of a personal note. With the new Crimeline schedule, I only release on the first and third Wednesdays of the month, unless it's a month like this where I do two-parter and then I release both of them and then we have another episode. It gets a little confusing. We do have a fifth Wednesday this month, so it'll actually be 2 weeks before the next Crimelines episode, but I have to say the extra week off is coming at a very good time because my son is getting married in mid-May. And I know you're probably thinking that there is no way I'm old enough to have a child getting married, and I definitely agree with that, but the calendar says otherwise. There is going to be a lot on my plate for the next few weeks leading up to the wedding, so having a week off is definitely welcome. And feel free to follow my personal Instagram at Charlie and KC if you want to see pictures of everything, because that's where I will be posting them. And then if you miss me too much, Beyond the Files is always available on Patreon, Apple subscriptions, and Supercast. So with all of that out of the way, let's get into today's case. It is another older case, like the one I covered earlier this month. So I promise next month I will do 2 more recent cases. But I have to say that the research process in these older cases is more interesting sometimes, and this one particularly stands out. The earliest article I used was from 1936, and the most recent was 2023. Getting to dive into things at newspapers.com while also playing the keyword game on Google searches, and then also having to fire up Google Translate on an immigration record from 1968. This is the type of research I love to do. Anyone can read a book and give you a book report on a case, but you have to really enjoy this type of work for a case like this, and thankfully I love it. Though I went through decades of old newspaper articles and other sources, this episode is going to lean on the 2017 and 2023 reporting in the Omaha World Herald by Henry Cordes. At this point, I think he's probably as close to an expert we will get on this case, as he has compiled old interviews, conducted new ones, talked to the police and the FBI about what was in their files, and I think he has a book here if he can find the time for it. He definitely has the voice for it. I read a lot of newspaper articles, including investigative journalism, and his were a step above the usual. He is a writer as much as he is a journalist, and I think this would make an incredible book. But while we wait on him to write that, let's go ahead and get started with Bill and Opal Arnold, who grew up in central Nebraska and were married in June of 1939. Thanks to the small-town newspapers who were publishing everyone's business back in the day, we can see that Opal started visiting with Bill and his family in the summer of 1936, shortly after they both graduated from high school. So this was clearly the start of their official courtship period. They may have started dating earlier, but not with an eye towards marriage, or at least not towards announcing it in the newspaper. At the time, they lived in small towns that are about 20 minutes apart on modern roads using modern cars, according to my very modern Google Maps. So I don't know how long it would have taken them to travel between houses back in 1936, but we do know, again, thanks to the newspapers publishing everybody's business, that Opal would go visit and spend several days at Bill's parents' house. According to Bill and Opal's wedding announcement, they both attended Kearney College in Kearney, Nebraska, starting in 1936, with Opal attending 1 year and Bill going for 2. They both ended up living and working in Lincoln, Nebraska by the time they got married, which had a lot more opportunities than central Nebraska. Lincoln was a proper city with upwards of 80,000 people living there at the time. So Bill and Opal married in June of 1939, and then by the time their first child was born in August of 1942, they were living in Omaha. They ended up having 2 sons who were about 3 years apart. Their oldest was William Leslie Arnold, who went by Les, and James Arnold, who went by Jimmy as a kid, and then Jim as he got older. Bill ran the Omaha office of Watkins Products, which is a company that is still around. When Bill was working for the company, they were a direct sales company where people went door to door selling home goods. And Bill made a decent living doing this, so they were able to buy a family home in a nicer neighborhood, and Opal was, as was the tradition at the time, a homemaker. They had their boys involved in all the usual things growing up, band, sports, Boy Scouts, and everyone thought their younger son Jimmy was a pretty good kid. Les, however, could be a handful, and he and his mother really butted heads. But it doesn't sound like anyone thought it was more than a strict mom and a spirited child. And as Les became a teenager and pushed for more independence, Opal pushed back. The whole story of the dynamic in that household would take years to come out, but it started unraveling in the public on Monday, September 29th, 1958, when something that never happened at Bill's office happened. 41-year-old Bill Arnold did not show up to work. Instead, 16-year-old Les drove to the office, opened things up, and told the employees that his parents had to go out of town last minute. Bill needed an assistant to take over for him while he was gone, which Les arranged that morning, and then he drove himself to school. This would actually be the second time Les told someone his parents were out of town. Just that weekend, on Saturday, he told a family friend that Bill and Opal were called out of town because of a family emergency. Les's grandparents were taking the train out to California, but his grandfather got confused, got off the train in Wyoming, and then wandered off. So Bill and Opal were headed out there to help look for him, taking the same train route that he had taken. The grandparents in question would have had to have been Bill's parents because Opal's father had died earlier that year. This family friend was alarmed when she got this phone call, and she offered to have Les's 13-year-old brother come stay with them while their parents were out of town, and Les said that would probably be for the best. For the next week, no one heard from Bill and Opal. Les stayed at the family home for a night or two before he joined Jim to stay at the family friend's house. But after a few nights there, the two boys went back home, getting themselves fed and to school on time while presumably waiting on their parents to return. After that first week was up on Sunday, October 5th, Les's grandparents, as in Bill's parents, showed up at the house. They had been trying to reach Bill and Opal and decided to drive the 3 hours to Omaha from their home in central Nebraska just to see what was going on. Les didn't tell them the wandering grandpa story because he couldn't. That story was about them. And Les didn't seem to have a very clear answer on where his parents were. So Bill's mother started calling around. She ended up hearing the lost grandfather story from someone else, and obviously she found it bizarre. But in spite of that, Bill's parents did the most Midwest 1950s thing they could have done, and they decided not to make a fuss. Why bother the police with this when surely Bill and Opal would be home soon enough? They were dependable people and dependable parents, and Bill had his business, so it didn't make sense to make a big deal of him going out of town. There were other family members who thought maybe they should go to the police earlier, but they deferred to Bill's parents, and they were all taking this wait-and-see approach. In the meantime, that same family friend who had watched the boys for a few nights was getting suspicious. Clearly, the Wyoming story didn't make any sense when Bill's parents were doing just fine in Nebraska, so she took the information Les had given her about when Bill and Opal left, and she used it to check the train schedules. There was no train leaving at that date and time heading west. So on Friday, October 10th, right around 2 weeks since she last heard from Opal and Bill, the friend called the police. That same day, the family decided to also go to the police. So on Saturday morning, after getting 2 reports of these people missing, the authorities picked up Les and took him to the station to ask him some questions. He was the last person to see his parents, and he was the only one who would have known where they went. Les was a smarter-than-average kid, But he was still just 16 years old, and he was at the end of his plausible stories. He very soon confessed to what really happened to his parents, at least his version of it, which is as close as we can ever get to the truth. But Les's confession requires a little backstory, and that backstory was known to the courts in the late 1950s, but it didn't really become public until the reporting by Henry Cordes in 2017. The dynamic in the Arnold household was complicated. What we know for a fact is that Opal was the stronger personality in the household between the parents, and Les was a difficult child with emotional outbursts. But we find ourselves in a little bit of a chicken or the egg scenario here. I don't know if you read the book We Need to Talk About Kevin by Lionel Shriver. Without giving away too much of the plot, in that story, a mother has trouble bonding with her infant son and dealing with his behaviors as a toddler and a preschooler. He then grows up to be a violent psychopath. So the question the book is posing is, did the mother's lack of connection to her child cause him to become a psychopath, or was he born that way, and that's why she had trouble bonding with him? The movie version of the book sort of leads you in how to feel about that, but the book itself leaves it much more on the reader to mull over that question, and because I read the book, I've mulled over that question for years. So related back to this case, the question is, was Les prone to angry outbursts as a child because his mother was domineering and harsh? Or was she strict and controlling because she had to get a handle on a kid who had behavioral issues? Maybe the answer is a little bit of both. Another likely factor to this dynamic between mother and son that we do have to take into consideration is Opal's own mental health issues. Les would say she was hospitalized twice for quote-unquote nervous breakdowns, though it is not clear to me if that was ever verified or even specified. And we don't know if these were bouts of depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder. Nervous breakdown was such a catch-all term back then that it could be almost anything. As Les got older, he learned to control himself and his behaviors, at least outside of the home. In school, he was seen as smart, charismatic, and talented. The worst infraction he had in high school, according to the Omaha World-Herald, was that he forgot to wear a belt to school one day, which was a dress code violation worthy of a write-up in the 1950s. And as a parent who sends kids to school in 2026, that blows my mind. I don't think my kids even own a belt. But being that this was the worst thing Les did in high school, it is clear he did well there. He played a sport every season. He did fall track, winter wrestling, and spring baseball. And he also played the tenor sax in the marching band and in the ROTC band. So he was keeping himself busy. From Les's point of view, though, none of this was good enough for his mother. Opal mocked his interest in music, and no one ever saw her at a track or wrestling meet or a baseball game to cheer him on or support him. One neighbor later said that it was like Les's younger brother Jim was an only child in Opal's eyes, and others did notice she was harsher on Les than she was on Jim. I think it is clear from these outside perspectives that Jim and Les experienced their mother differently because she showed up differently for each of them. And from my own experiences and talking to friends, I think this is something that happens pretty often and people don't talk about it enough. And they particularly don't talk about it with their siblings enough, and it actually leads to conflict between brothers and sisters. With all that said, it is only fair to point out that when Les would later talk about his relationship with his mother, it was at a time when it was more advantageous to him to paint things as rough as possible. So he talked about things like how Opal kicked him out of the house multiple times when he was 15 and 16. But he didn't mention that one of those times she simply locked the door behind him after he ran away. And it doesn't seem like Les mentioned that there was physical violence in the home, which there was, but not from Opal as far as I can tell. It was Les. He was a bully to his younger brother even after he managed to learn to keep it together at school, and Jim did not deserve that abuse from an older and bigger sibling. The way Jim saw it, based on his interviews, is that it was much more Opal responding to Les's behavior in the home. Yes, her discipline escalated, but it escalated right behind Les's outbursts. So this was the existing dynamic in the home in September of 1958. And, if anything, Les and Opal were arguing more than ever because Les had a girlfriend. As 16-year-olds can do, he fell head over heels for her, but Opal did not approve at all. Les said her biggest complaint was that his girlfriend Crystal's family was blue-collar, and she considered them, quote, trash. But we also know Les did what teens sometimes do, and he made Crystal a central part of his life. He wanted to be on the phone with her constantly, which tied up the phone line, which annoyed his mother. He wanted to borrow a car to take her on dates frequently. And the time he ran away and Opal locked the door behind him, he ran away because the family was going away for the weekend, but he wanted to stay in town so he could spend that time with his girlfriend. Saturday, September 27th, 1958 was yet another day of Les and Opal arguing about this girlfriend. Les had planned a date with Crystal for that night, and he already got permission to take one of the family's cars so he could take her and her brother to the drive-in, so he was pretty excited. He was talking to Crystal on the phone earlier in the day, and he pulled the cord of the phone so that he could close the door behind him and talk privately. Opal didn't allow this for some reason, and she opened the door to where he was sitting and basically told him there was nothing he needed to say to Crystal that everyone else couldn't hear. And according to Les, Opal then made a comment about Crystal being no good, and she didn't say it quietly or under her breath. She said it loudly enough that he thought the receiver may have picked it up and Crystal heard it. So this is where our backstory is going to end and our confession is going to begin. This is how it was reported in the Omaha World-Herald in 2017. Les said he hung up with Crystal and he and Opal got into an argument that started because he perceived Opal as treating Crystal poorly. The argument continued for some time with all of their complaints being litigated. And it kept going until Opal finally told Les that was it. No drive-in that night. This was something Les said his mother would do regularly. She would give him permission to go somewhere or do something and then find a reason to revoke that permission. Les was angry and he admitted he punched a wall. Opal then told him to go to his room, which he did. But rather than calm down, he stewed. I've been decluttering and refreshing my wardrobe as part of my spring cleaning, and I find that I am just continually drawn to pieces that are well-made and easy to reach for every day. It's a very quality over quantity mindset, and Quince has absolutely found its place in my closet. The fabrics feel elevated, the designs are intentional, and the pricing actually makes sense. Quince's spring style is focused on lightweight and breathable materials, and like their entire collection, these are beautiful pieces using premium materials like 100% European linen, organic cotton, and super soft denim. Quince works directly with ethical factories and cuts out the middleman, so you're paying for quality and not the brand markup. Styles start right around $50, and they're the kinds of things you can throw on and look put together. That same focus on materials and quality carries over into their accessories, like their leather bags, which are made from 100% hand-woven Italian leather, and honestly, they look way more expensive than they are. I absolutely love my Quince trapeze bag. The leather is the right amount of softness while still holding its shape, and the quality is right up there with bags I paid a lot more for. Refresh your spring wardrobe with Quince. Go to quince.com/crimelines for free shipping and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. Go to quince.com/crimelines for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/crimelines. He went back out and started arguing with his mom again, trying to convince her to let him go to the drive-in. She again said no, and this time she told Les to go for a walk to cool down. It was around 2:30 in the afternoon when Les came back home from his walk, but he was not any calmer, probably because he still wasn't getting his way. The date was canceled, according to Opal. Les told the police that he wanted to show his mom that he was serious about going on this date and maybe even scare her into conceding. So he went to his parents' closet and pulled out their .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle. He walked to the dining room where Opal was and pointed the gun at her. Opal wasn't scared, according to Les. She was almost defiant. She laughed and said, "What are you going to do? Shoot me?" And that is when he pulled the trigger. In his statement, he seemed focused on the fact that she laughed at him and that he didn't plan to pull the trigger until that point. Les said he felt badly that he had hurt his mom, but he was unable to get her laugh out of his head. So while she was on the floor, he fired 5 more times. According to Les, his father came home right after this while he was still standing near his mother's body. When Bill saw Opal on the ground and Les with a gun, Les said Bill swung at him but missed. When Bill tried to attack him again, Les pulled the trigger. And like he did with Opal, he continued to fire into Bill's body after he was on the floor. An early report in the newspaper said that at that point the gun jammed, but I only saw that detail in one spot. Not sure what to do next, Les said he dragged their bodies into the basement and then put the bloody dining room rug in the garage. He then called that family friend and told the story about his parents having to go out of town, and that solved one of his immediate problems: what to do about his younger brother. Jim was at his part-time job when the shootings happened, so when he came home, Les intercepted him out front, said their parents were out of town, and told him to go to the friend's house for the night. Les then cleaned up, got dressed, and then he went out on his scheduled date with Crystal. The next day, Sunday, Les decided to do everything like normal. He had slept horribly knowing his parents' bodies were in the basement, but he got himself to church, and then afterwards, he asked a neighbor to borrow a shovel. He spent the day with his girlfriend's family, and then, when it was dark, he went home and dug a hole in the back corner of their yard under a lilac bush. It was hard work, and it took hours. When he was done, Les dragged his parents' bodies to the shallow grave and buried them together. He then started disposing of evidence. He drove the bloody rug from the dining room out to the creek and threw it in. The reporting from 2017 made it sound like there was just this one rug, but there was reports from back in 1958 saying that there were also 2 other smaller rugs that the police were looking to recover from the creek. After Les Arnold told his story, the police asked if he would show them where his parents' bodies were. He agreed, so they went back out to his house, but word travels fast in a small town. Now, Omaha wasn't a small town, but it was a Midwest city, and that is almost the same thing. I live in Kansas City, and it's the same thing here. No one is more than 3 degrees separated from anyone else, and rumors spread quickly. So by the time the police got to the house at noon on Saturday, the same day they picked Les up for questioning, neighbors and a reporter were there wondering what was going on. They all watched as Les pointed to an area of disturbed dirt under the bush, and they didn't actually just watch this. A photographer with the newspaper was there and took a picture from the other side of the fence of Les standing there, surrounded by detectives and pointing to his parents' grave. The police then dug until they found the bodies of 41-year-old Bill Arnold and 40-year-old Opal Arnold. The autopsy showed that they had both been shot 6 times, and a search of the house found bullet holes in the dining room. And according to an Evening World Herald article from October of 1958, the murder weapon had been returned to the closet. All of these details back up Les's confession. So with that, William Leslie Arnold was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Though he was just 16 years old, he was facing the death penalty. It wasn't until 1988 that the U.S. banned death sentences for minors under the age of 16, and it wasn't until 2005 that it was banned for 16 and 17-year-olds. So the stakes were high, and Les certainly had his supporters, including his girlfriend's parents who became his legal guardians. He also got jail visits from various uncles, and family members hired him an attorney. They told Les not to talk to the police, but it was a little too late for that. He had already told them pretty much everything. One person who didn't really support Les was his brother Jim, whose entire life was turned on its head. Jim has spoken out as an adult, and he told the Omaha World-Herald that after he was shipped off to live with relatives in Missouri, he didn't tell anyone what happened, beyond the fact that his parents died when he was 13. He let people just assume it was an accident, and it wasn't until the 1990s that he went to see a therapist about his trauma. He was encouraged to talk about it with people he trusted, so he finally told his kids about it, and they were adults at that time. This was a very deep wound, and Jim only saw Les once after his arrest, and you can understand why. The legal process in this case moved relatively quickly. Les pleaded not guilty initially, which we often see in cases where a plea deal might be on the table, or maybe an insanity defense, or sometimes the plea is just a placeholder to get some extra time to come up with a defense strategy. But one article from back in 1959 got me to do a little extra research. It said, quote, "Nebraska law precludes a plea of guilty to first-degree murder." So Les could not plead guilty and just move to sentencing because he was facing the death penalty. State law required that a trial be held so that the judge and jury could hear all of the evidence. And then, once he was declared guilty, they could then move to sentencing. It's clear from the reporting that everyone thought a plea deal was going to be reached, though the state denied reports that it was happening right up until the day it actually happened. What the papers printed at the time was very vague. It just said that a plea deal reducing the charges to second-degree murder was appropriate given the background on the case. But that's about all they said. The background itself wasn't in the papers as far as I can tell until Henry Cordes' series in the Omaha World-Herald in 2017. With second-degree murder, the state was saying they believed that Les maliciously and purposefully killed his parents, but they believed his story that it was without premeditation. He was then sentenced to life in prison, with his first chance at parole being after just 10 years. And he had a fair chance of getting it. That early parole opportunity really had to do with the time period. This was before the beginning of the tough-on-crime policies that started in the 1970s during Nixon's administration. And I only point out that Richard Nixon was the one who really started this because it's ironic given the scandal that would end his presidency. But these policies were popular with voters, so this was not a partisan issue. Nearly every politician jumped on board, and before we knew it, parole in murder cases was being granted less often and after longer time spent locked up. Back in the 1950s, the average life with parole sentence was about 17 years. Fast forward to the 1990s, and it was almost 30 years. Given Les's age and the extenuating circumstances, if Les behaved himself in prison, he might only have to serve those 10 years. And Les did behave for the most part. He finished high school while locked up, tutored other inmates, and he had no serious disciplinary issues. One time he got in trouble for making himself eggs and sausage when he had kitchen duty, and another time someone complained that he complained too much while on a work detail. But these were very much like the missing belt in high school. They were minor issues. Les did appeal in 1965. He had pleaded guilty, so he didn't really have a trial to then have grounds for a direct appeal. And prior to 1965, Nebraska actually didn't do post-conviction relief on the state level. That had to go to the federal courts, which was a bit less accessible to a guy in prison with no lawyer. But then in 1965, a new law started a state process for post-conviction relief petitions, and Les took advantage of the opportunity. He said he wanted his sentence vacated for a number of reasons. He claimed he was arrested without a warrant. He was not told about his right to an attorney. He was coerced into confessing without an attorney or an adult family member present. and he said he was coerced by both his attorney and the county attorney to plead guilty. The petition was denied, but Les did have a positive thing happen that same year. He got trustee status. This was often seen as a step towards parole because it meant you were considered a trustworthy inmate. With this, Les was moved from the main cell block buildings into a dormitory that was outside of the main wall of the prison, but it did still have a 12-foot fence with barbed wire on top. But there was more freedom of movement, so he could go outside more often and walk around, and there was even a music room where he could practice instruments. Having this type of status works very well at a parole hearing, and so the odds were in his favor going into his first hearing, if he had ever made it to that point. But he didn't, because in 1967, Les decided to leave prison another way. On the morning of July 15, 1967, it was announced that two prisoners, 24-year-old William Leslie Arnold and 33-year-old James Harding, had escaped. They were noted to have been there for their 5 a.m. bed check, but not present at 7:30. Just a little background on James Harding. He was also in prison for life after he killed a man named Richard Whitehall during the robbery of a bar. Like Les, he did have hope for parole one day, and he had the trustee status, but he probably had several more years to serve given his criminal history. One report indicated that the guards only realized the men were gone when one of them noticed that a jacket had been put on top of the 12-foot fence surrounding the prison. It covered the barbed wire, which would have made it possible for someone to safely climb over the fence. When they saw this, they decided to do an inmate head count, and that is when they realized the men were gone. A search of the prison uncovered that the bars on the window in the music room had been sawed through and then stuck back together, so they looked secure at first glance. It was only when they looked closely that they could see what was going on. A massive multi-state search began for the men, and pictures of them were put in all of the papers. But there was a big issue with the photo they had of Les Arnold. It was taken when he was first sent to state prison when he was 17 years old, and all the normal changes that happened between the teen years and the mid-20s happened here. At 27, Les was 2 inches taller and 30 to 40 pounds heavier than he had been at intake, and he just looked older, so the picture they had was not a good likeness, and you can thank Les Arnold for being one of the main reasons prisons started updating inmate photographs periodically. There were some leads that came in over the next several months, but the authorities said the case was notable due to the lack of leads. It took until May of the following year, 1968, before either man was found, and it wasn't Les Arnold. James Harding had made it out to California completely under the radar, but someone saw him in a bar and called the FBI saying she thought she saw a suspected fugitive. The twist here, though, was that she thought he was a different wanted man. At the time, there was an international manhunt for James Earl Ray, the suspected assassin of Martin Luther King Jr., who was killed in April of 1968. And James Harding and James Earl Ray happened to resemble each other. So FBI agents moved in and detained James, thinking he was the other James, and he was using a fake name, but they figured out who he was. He was a fugitive, just not their fugitive. So they shipped him back to Nebraska, where a year was added onto his sentence for the escape. With James Harding back in custody, he did talk a little bit about the escape, and then in other interviews over the years, many more details came out. James said that he and Les were not really friends in prison, but they had a mutual friend introduce them because they had both expressed a desire to escape. They made the plan with another friend who was getting paroled. Because this friend had been released from prison, he was able to set things up from the outside. James refused to say who that friend on the outside was, but the investigators eventually figured it out, and the man did confirm parts of James's story. He got rubber masks and hacksaw blades for them, and when he knew he had what was needed and everything was in place, he sent the men a message through none other than the personal ad section in the Omaha World-Herald. I looked the ad up, and I actually found the original print of it at newspapers.com. The ad ran daily from July 5th through the 14th of 1957, and it said, quote, "NOF arrives July 14th," end quote. Then it said 24-hour hotline and had a phone number listed. There is absolutely no way for me to know whose phone number that was back in 1957 or if it was a code. And we also don't know what NOF stands for. By the time James Harding told the Omaha World-Herald about the meaning behind that personal ad in 2001, he couldn't remember exactly what it meant. He just knew that it was the message to let him and Les know what day they needed to be ready to escape. One day around this time, James was out early in the morning taking a walk, as he often did, and he found a cardboard tube that the friend had thrown over the prison fence. It contained the hacksaw blades and those rubber masks. 4 days, Les and James worked at sawing the bars in the music room until they got through them. They then put them back together using chewing gum so they didn't look disturbed. And then, after lights out on the night of July 14th, they did what the Alcatraz escapees did. They stuffed their beds to make it look like they were in them, and they put the masks on their pillows to look like sleeping heads. And then they took off. The detail of the dummy heads was not in the original reporting because they were not found in the morning, and Henry Cotis with the Omaha World-Herald speculated that other inmates may have hidden them after morning call so that the guards wouldn't notice that they didn't get out of bed. And this entire ruse worked. The men went out the window, over the fence, to a waiting car, and then they got driven to Omaha, all the while the guards were doing their rounds and saw nothing out of the ordinary. Once they got to Omaha, Les called a childhood friend who had continued to visit him in prison over the years, and he told him that he had escaped and he needed help. This friend, who was in training to become a minister, decided to help him. When he came forward decades later, he said it was because he always felt bad for what Les had gone through growing up in his home. He didn't think Les was a danger to the larger community. He was just a kid stuck in an abusive situation who did something bad. That's how he saw it. So he brought the men food, clothes, cash, and drove them to the bus station, where they then boarded a bus headed to Chicago. By 3 a.m., they were headed out of state, and that was 4.5 hours before any guard noticed they were missing. After Les and James got to Chicago, they went to a church and presented themselves as two men down on their luck. They stayed in a shelter, and Les quickly got a job washing dishes at a restaurant. He was eventually made a line cook, a skill he picked up in prison, and in very short order, he met a server at the restaurant, started dating her, and moved into her apartment. James left at this point, heading to California, so he knew nothing else beyond this. Or at least nothing else he was willing to share. The paroled inmate who helped them escape and the reverend who got them out of town were never charged because their names came out after the statute of limitations had long passed. The reverend, however, it turned out, had been questioned early on because they interviewed everyone who had visited either James Harding or Les Arnold in the weeks leading up to the escape, and he was on that list. He lied and said he knew nothing. After James Harding was recaptured, he served 8 more years before getting paroled, and he said he was glad he got caught. He couldn't imagine spending the rest of his life looking over his shoulder like he imagined Les Arnold had to do. Over the years, a lot of theories were thrown out there about what happened to Les. One theory was that he moved out west. It was reported in 1974 that a man was pulled over for drunk driving in Oregon, and his fingerprint card came back a match to Les Arnold. But by the time all the pieces were connected, he had already been released. It's not clear if this was actually him or not. In 1976, a detective told the papers, quote, "I'll bet he's married somewhere and has a couple of kids. I have no evidence, just a gut feeling," end quote. And that is going to be your little piece of foreshadowing for this episode. This detective was not the only person who thought Les Arnold was alive and well out there, but he was close to the only one. A lot of people assumed Les had to have died by the mid-1970s because he couldn't have survived on the run that long without leaving a trace. Fast forward all the way to 2010, and the authorities were still looking for him. He had been missing for 43 years, and those who got the case on their desk had a tendency to become a little obsessed with it. One such investigator had gone to a conference and learned how you can see when Google searches occur and the general area they come from. He decided to see if anyone was searching up this case. In his investigation, he found that someone had searched him, the investigator, using an internet service provider in South America. And someone, again in South America, had looked up Les Arnold on the Department of Corrections inmate database. But this person did not look him up by name. They used his inmate number, and who, aside from Les Arnold, would even know that information? And this was not the first time South America came up. James Harding said that Les talked about how if you go to Brazil and have a child there, he heard they would not allow you to be extradited. I tried to look this up, and the closest I could get is that this is true if the crime you are wanted for is kidnapping a child in a custody dispute, and that child is a Brazilian citizen. But otherwise, the two words I know in Portuguese are not enough for me to research 1960s Brazilian immigration and extradition law. This Brazil theory, though, got a giant check in its favor in 2017. The Omaha World-Herald ran a 3-part series on this case, written by Henry Cordes, in the event I haven't said his name enough, and it was a big source for this episode. It also inspired an amateur genealogist who read the series and decided to do his own digging. He fired up Family Search, the same website I generally use when I'm looking for details of old cases or to get biographical information on a victim when there isn't much out there. He decided to just go ahead and type William Leslie Arnold in and see what happened. And he got a hit on an immigration card from Brazil. Most of the card is not filled out, like the names of his parents and his address, but it has the right birth date, August 28th, 1942, and birthplace, Omaha, Nebraska. The card, which was a registration card for foreigners, was issued on December 7th, 1958, about a year and a half after the escape, but it's not clear if it was issued right when that person entered the country or if he had been there already. On the back of the card was a typed message. I had to use Google Translate on it, and it says, quote, Interpol requests information on the alien being sought by the FBI. Also uses the name Les Arnold, end quote. There is then another notation under that, which was difficult to translate because it uses abbreviations, but I searched what those abbreviations mean in Brazil, and then I Google translated it backwards, and it looks to me like it says, according to the State Secretariat of Public Security, who is in charge of the police, there was a Xerox copy from the FBI requesting capture. Maybe that just meant the wanted poster. Henry Cordes did what journalists do, and he asked the FBI about this immigration card, and they said they found no reference to this lead in their files, so it's not clear what type of follow-up occurred. But this one document mentioned Interpol, the FBI, and Brazil's State Secretariat of Public Security. It would be baffling to me if this somehow slipped through the cracks until a guy on his computer in Nebraska found it on a family history website almost 60 years later. The lead was interesting for sure, but it didn't seem to get them any closer to Les Arnold's current whereabouts. So in 2020, after learning more about the capture of the Golden State Killer and the use of forensic genetic genealogy, the U.S. Marshals wondered if there was a way to find Les through this method. He would have been a fool to put his own DNA into any system, but maybe he had kids or grandkids who did. Law enforcement is not allowed to use private databases like Ancestry and 23andMe. However, private citizens can. And Les's younger brother, Jim, was still alive. In late 2020, Jim agreed to provide a DNA sample for a commercial company. He had no interest in reconnecting with his brother should they find him, but he wasn't going to stand in the authorities' way of tracking him down. According to the podcast The Gift, all Jim wanted in return was for them to give him the breakdown of what countries his family came from, which I think is the biggest draw of these DNA tests for a lot of people. The podcast The Gift, as a side note, is really worth the listen. They had 2 seasons and they covered stories of people who did DNA tests like this and got surprising results. It is called The Gift because so many people get these DNA kits as holiday gifts. So it's an interesting podcast if you are the type who likes to hear surprising snapshots of people's life stories. And if I didn't know how this story ended already, I think my jaw would have dropped listening to that one. Anyway, back to the case. Jim's DNA sat in the database connecting with random but known distant relatives for well over a year. Then one day in 2022, the deputy marshal monitoring the account saw a message pop up. It was from a man in Australia, who we will call Jake, who was looking for his father's relatives. His father, John Vincent Damon, had grown up in Chicago when he was an orphan, so this man was just curious about his family history. In looking at the percentage of the match, the deputy marshal believed almost immediately that this had to be Les's son. The match was in the range of a nephew-uncle situation, and Les and Jim didn't have any other siblings. And they knew Les left Omaha for Chicago, and the orphan part, well, that was also true. The deputy marshal replied, not letting Jake know anything other than that he was a representative of the person whose DNA was matched. He asked Jake for photos of his father, and when he saw those, he knew he had the right guy. But he didn't want to overplay his hand because, though Jake said his father was dead, they needed to know for sure. If Les was alive and found out the police were onto him, he might disappear again. Jake did an interview with the podcast The Gift as well as with the Omaha World Herald, and he was very open and willing to talk about this, but for privacy reasons, he has asked that his real name and specific location not be put out there. Jake said in these interviews that the communication with the representative was weird. Jake was trying to get answers about his father's life, and this person was more interested in asking questions. He wouldn't tell Jake much until he confirmed his father was dead. On the marshal side of things, he told the podcast The Gift that he was worried Jake was going to hear the news of who his father was from someone else because Jake said he messaged pretty much everyone who had a relatively high match to his DNA. The marshal didn't want Jake to hear that his father was a wanted murderer from some stranger he didn't know in a typed message that might not be delivered compassionately. So after several days of this back and forth messaging, they decided to do a video call. Jake showed his father's death certificate to the camera, showing that his father did die in 2010, and the marshal showed his badge to Jake. Once they had all of that established, Jake learned the truth about his father. The Chicago orphan he knew as John Vincent Damon was actually the Omaha-raised William Leslie Arnold. With this information, especially the name of the alias he lived under, Les Arnold's life on the run was uncovered. The last thing James Harding knew about Les was that he moved in with a woman in Chicago, and that was 100% true. Les met a woman named Jean while working at the restaurant, and Jean was a struggling single mom living in public housing with her 4 daughters who were 14, 12, 9, and 5. Her daughter said that it was rather sudden that John Damon, aka Les Arnold, came into their lives. In fact, Jean and Les married just 4 months after his escape from prison. It's not clear what, if anything, Jean knew about Les's true identity because she died by the time this was all uncovered. Her daughters, who have spoken to the media, said they themselves knew nothing about it. They got the same story that Les's son got. He was an orphan from Chicago. but Les's stepdaughters pointed out how this really was the perfect cover. The authorities were looking for a single escaped convict, not a hardworking married father of 4. It was while Les was with Jean that he got a forged birth certificate showing he was born in Chicago on August 1st, 1941, which meant he added a year and 27 days to his actual age. We know he was with Jean at this point because he used her maiden name of Jean Stanley as the name of his mother. The family stayed in Chicago for 2 years before they moved to Cincinnati in 1969 after Les became a traveling salesman, and then they moved to Miami in 1971. Les's stepdaughter said the move to Miami was abrupt. Jean and Les went to the Bahamas on a trip, and they went there through Miami. On the way back, Jean stayed in Miami to find a place for them to live while Les went to Ohio to pack things up and get the girls. The oldest daughter was a senior in high school at this point, so she decided to stay behind to finish school, and she remembered that months after Jean and Les left the area, someone she believed was an FBI agent showed up at the door looking for Les, but they did use his alias John Damon. This was another thing Henry Cordes tried to verify with the FBI, but they didn't have any record of it. And the daughter said when she asked her parents about it, they just didn't have a good answer of why the authorities would be looking for him. Jean and Les stayed in Miami until about 1976 when they separated. Les had been talking about wanting to move again, maybe to Hawaii, maybe to Costa Rica, but Jean loved Florida, and that was one factor in the divorce. So Jean stayed in Miami while Les moved away. He ended up filing for divorce in Los Angeles, where he was living at the time. They decided to just settle their marital assets and split things privately, so the divorce went through in 1977 without Jean even filing an answer. Les had been the only father his stepdaughters had, and so they stayed in touch with him even after the divorce and after he remarried in 1983. In 1986, when Les was 44, he and his wife had a baby girl, and then in 1991, their son was born. In 1992, Les went to Miami to see his stepdaughters, and he told them that he was moving out of the country because Los Angeles was not a safe place to raise a family. He wanted to say goodbye to them. They were sad to see him go, but one of his stepdaughters gave him a piece of advice. Basically, she told him to be better to his own daughter than he was to them. Les was an active father figure for the girls. He taught them piano and he took them places, but he was also very strict and controlling. Not unlike how he described Opal, right down to giving them long lists of chores that he demanded to be done right, and his insistence that they had to have paying jobs at 13. And this is something I'm sure the stepdaughters are probably going to be processing for a while after learning Les's backstory. He was repeating old patterns in how he raised them, patterns that he used to explain, justify shooting his mother. And I think that would be difficult to hear about as someone who bore the brunt of him doing those things. Whether it was time, age, or his stepdaughter's advice that changed him, I'm not sure, but Les was not that type of father to his 2 children, according to his son. He was incredibly supportive and loving to them. It's not clear why Les decided to leave the country in 1992, but it seems like something might have spooked him. Because it wasn't just that he moved. He also had surgery to remove a mole on his face because he said he was tired of nicking it when shaving, which makes sense. But that mole was also listed as a feature on his wanted poster. And then after the 1992 meeting with his stepdaughters, they never heard from him again. He completely cut ties with his only remaining personal link to the United States. Some speculation I saw online was that the rise of the internet must have been why he left. Les was able to fly under the radar for so long because who was even looking for him after all that time? His old, faded wanted poster was not following him around the country. But with the internet, that poster could pop up in anyone's house. So Les and his family moved first to New Zealand in 1992 and then to Australia in 1997, which is where they settled down. Les did travel occasionally to the United States for work. He was still working as a salesman, but it's unclear if or when he ever went to Brazil. He was already married to Jean by the time the Brazilian immigration card was filed. So did he go there and the stepdaughters just don't remember it? Or another theory, he had someone else pose as him and that person filled out the card to throw the authorities off of Les's trail, especially after his escape partner got caught. The immigration card from Brazil and the Google searches from South America remain questions in this case. Something also notable is that Les stopped traveling to the United States for work after 9/11, so right after security at airports got much, much stricter. It was around this time that Les began dealing with heart issues that led to his death in August of 2010 from blood clots, and his family thought he died just after his 69th birthday, but he actually died a couple weeks before his 68th. Les's son, who we are calling Jake, was just 19 when his dad died, and he was curious about that side of his family. He only knew little bits about his dad's upbringing. He knew he played the saxophone growing up and loved music. Les had said he worked as a dental tech when he was younger, which he did. He just didn't mention it was a prison job of his. But to avoid most questions, Les said he had a rough upbringing in a Chicago orphanage, and it wasn't really something he wanted to rehash. So the family learned to just not ask questions. But once his father was gone, Jake realized he wanted the answers to some of those questions he never asked, and he thought at the very least he could inform any surviving family members of his dad's passing. He had his dad's birth certificate as a starting point, so he searched up his dad's name, John Damon, and his grandparents' names on genealogy websites, but he never found them. So one year, he and his wife took a trip to the United States, and they decided to go to Chicago. Jake hoped he could get more information from vital records, so he walked in with his father's birth certificate and showed it to them. The man took it and said he would be right back, and about 10 minutes later, another man came out and said the birth certificate was fake. It had been a good enough forgery for Les to use it to get other documents like a social security card, but that was the sort of thing that worked back in the 1960s. But in the 2010s, they could just type the names into their database to find the original birth certificate, and nothing came back, so it was obvious it was a forgery. This left Jake even more confused. Why would his father have a fake birth certificate? Did he have it forged himself, or was he given a fake document by the orphanage? This trip to Chicago led to even more questions. And that is how it went. Off and on for years, Jake would look for his father's family and would end up with either more questions or just dead ends. Then, in 2022, Netflix released their documentary, Our Father, about Dr. Donald Klein. If you've not seen it, it's about a fertility doctor who used his own sperm to impregnate patients, and he fathered nearly 100 children this way. He got caught when one of those children did an at-home DNA test and got matched to several half-siblings. Well, Jake and his wife watched this documentary, and the thing that stood out to Jake was that you can find relatives with these DNA tests. So he ordered one, sent it in, and matched to Jim Arnold. He sent his message out to the closest matches and reached the U.S. Marshal. And that is how we, as a public, found out in 2023 what really happened to William Leslie Arnold. And while the public and the authorities have their answer, I doubt it's that simple for those who knew him personally, whether they knew him as Les Arnold or as John Damon. From his brother Jim, who was really a victim in all of this, to his stepdaughters who experienced his parenting like he had been parented, to his kids who had an amazing experience with him, Les Arnold touched all of their lives in different ways. Just like Opal was a different mother to her two kids, it seems Les found that to be true for himself as well. With the life experience and financial stability that Les had in his 40s, and then after moving to a country where he wasn't looking over his shoulder waiting to get caught, maybe that's when he could be the type of parent he wanted to be. As far as how Les worked through living with what he did to his parents, that was something he carried alone and secretly. But his son told the Omaha World-Herald in 2023 that Les's Bible was full of highlighted scriptures about sin and forgiveness. It is time for April Patreon birthday shoutouts, and this is a special month to me because my birthday is also in April. I am going to be an age this year, and I'm really looking forward to that. When I was a little kid, one of my favorite jokes was April showers bring Mayflowers, and what do Mayflowers bring? Pilgrims. Because I grew up in Connecticut where pilgrims are strangely a big deal, and also because April showers, and I was born in April. So you get my favorite joke of my childhood for this month as my gift to you. And in addition to that incredible joke, I will give you your shout out. So a very happy birthday goes to Shayla, Lark, Eileen, Riverside, Ruth, Quinn, Sarah, Kimberly, Michaela, Crystal, and Denise. I hope you have an incredible birthday month and a wonderful year. And from me to you, I want to say happy birthday.